Everyone in the Meridian Financial Tower called her the Boot Lady and laughed when Grace Washington, wearing desert tan combat boots and pushing a cleaning cart, walked past their executive offices each morning. The cruel whispers followed her everywhere, playing dress-up, living out some fantasy, probably bought them at army surplus. They had no idea who she really was, what those boots represented, or that Marine One was about to land on their rooftop. What happened next would silence every mocking voice. Before we start, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's continue. Grace Washington had been invisible for exactly 847 days. She knew the count because every morning at 4:47 a.m., she stood in her small Pilsen apartment, lacing up the same pair of desert tan combat boots that had carried her through 3 tours in Afghanistan, and later, through the worst day of her life at Camp Pendleton. The October morning air bit through her navy blue uniform as she walked the 12 blocks to the Meridian Financial Tower, Chicago's gleaming monument to corporate success. Her breath created small clouds in the pre-dawn darkness, and her boots, polished to mirror shine despite their worn leather, struck the sidewalk with military precision. Grace had learned long ago that how you carried yourself mattered more than what you carried. Inside her cleaning cart's hidden compartment, wrapped in protective plastic, lay a folded American flag and a photograph of Marine Lance Corporal Marcus Washington, her son, in his dress blues. The photo had been taken 3 weeks before the training accident that sent her world spinning into an orbit she was still trying to escape. "Morning, Mrs. Washington," called Tony from the security desk as Grace badged into the building. He was one of the few who treated her like a human being rather than a piece of furniture that happened to move. "Morning, Tony. How's your daughter's college applications going?" "Still working on them. Thanks for asking." Tony's smile was genuine. "You're the only one in this whole building who remembers she exists." Grace nodded, pushing her cart toward the service elevator. She remembered everyone's stories because stories mattered. They were what made people real, what connected them to something larger than the marble and glass cage they worked in every day. The elevator rose silently to the 37th floor, where she would spend the next 8 hours cleaning the offices of people who made more in a month than she made in a year. But Grace didn't clean for the money, though she desperately needed it. She cleaned because work gave structure to grief, and structure was the only thing keeping her from drowning in the silence Marcus had left behind. She pulled out her supplies with practiced efficiency: microfiber cloths, glass cleaner, vacuum, trash bags. Her movements were economical, purposeful, habits carved by years of military discipline and reinforced by necessity. The boots squeaked slightly against the polished marble, a sound that would later echo in Kevin's nightmares. 15 miles away, in a Lincoln Park penthouse that cost more than most people's houses, Kevin Mitchell was having his own morning ritual, though his involved Italian espresso and a view of Lake Michigan rather than instant coffee and concern about making rent. Kevin stood 6'2" with the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to prove himself to anyone. His sandy hair was styled with products that cost more than Grace's weekly grocery budget, and his charcoal Tom Ford suit hung perfectly on his athletic frame. At 34, he was Meridian Financial's youngest senior vice president, a fact he mentioned frequently in conversations and LinkedIn posts. His Tribeca apartment was a monument to success: exposed brick walls, modern art that he'd bought because his decorator said it was investment-worthy, and furniture that looked expensive because it was. Everything was chosen to impress, nothing to comfort. "Henderson Industries is hemorrhaging money," Kevin muttered to himself, reviewing the merger documents on his tablet while his BMW's heated seats warmed his back during the drive downtown. "But their real estate portfolio is worth the headache." Kevin had built his career on seeing value where others saw problems, on turning desperate situations into profitable opportunities. He was good at it, good enough to afford the BMW, the penthouse, the suits, the lifestyle that his Northwestern MBA classmates envied on social media. What he wasn't good at was seeing people. The parking garage beneath Meridian Tower was filled with luxury cars, Audis, Mercedes, Porsches, vehicles that announced their owner's importance before they even stepped foot in the building. Kevin's BMW M5 fit right in, sliding into his reserved spot with German precision. He checked his reflection in the elevator's polished steel walls, adjusting his burgundy tie. The Henderson presentation was at 10, which gave him 3 hours to review the final projections and coordinate with his team. If everything went well, the deal would close by Christmas, securing his promotion to executive vice president and the 7-figure salary that came with it. The elevator doors opened on the 37th floor at exactly 7:23 a.m., just as Grace was emptying the trash bin outside Kevin's office. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, her deep brown ones, tired but alert, and his pale blue ones, already calculating the day ahead. Grace stepped aside, giving him room to pass, her cleaning cart rolling silently on well-maintained wheels. "Morning," she said softly, the word carrying the weight of genuine politeness. Kevin's gaze dropped to her feet, where the desert tan combat boots stood out starkly against her navy uniform. His brow furrowed slightly, not in recognition of service or sacrifice, but in the kind of casual judgment that came as naturally to him as breathing. "Morning," he replied, his voice already distant, his mind already moving past her toward more important things. As Kevin disappeared into his corner office, Grace continued her methodical cleaning, unaware that in 3 hours, her carefully constructed invisibility would shatter in a way that would change both their lives forever. She moved through the morning routine with quiet efficiency, her boots marking time against the marble like a metronome, counting down to a moment neither of them could imagine. In her cart, Marcus's photograph remained safely hidden, along with the flag that had draped his coffin and the letter from his commanding officer that she still couldn't bring herself to read. Outside the windows, Chicago awakened to another ordinary Tuesday in October, the kind of day when nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. The 27th floor conference room buzzed with the kind of energy that came from men who believed their opinions mattered more than anyone else's. Kevin sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, surrounded by his team. Brad Chen from Acquisitions, Tyler Rodriguez from Legal, and Danny O'Connor from Finance. Their suits were sharp, their coffee was expensive, and their confidence was absolute. "Henderson's Q3 numbers are worse than we thought," Kevin said, sliding copies of the financial report across the table. "Their manufacturing division is bleeding cash, but their Chicago real estate alone is worth the acquisition price." Brad leaned back in his leather chair, his MIT class ring catching the morning light. "So we're essentially buying buildings and getting a failing company for free?" "Exactly. We gut the manufacturing, keep the real estate, and flip the rest. Easy money." Outside in the hallway, Grace moved with practiced silence, her cleaning cartwheels barely audible on the marble floor. She had learned to time her work around the executive schedules. They preferred pretending she didn't exist, and she was happy to oblige. The less attention she drew, the fewer problems she faced. She began cleaning the conference room's exterior windows, her movements methodical and precise. The glass cleaner left no streaks, no evidence of her presence except for the crystal-clear view of Lake Michigan that the executives would enjoy without ever thinking about who made it possible. "Did you see the janitor lady today?" Danny's voice carried easily through the conference room's glass walls. "Still wearing those ridiculous boots." Grace's hand stilled on the window. Her breath caught in her throat, but she continued cleaning, hoping they would move on to other topics. "What is it with those things?" Tyler laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Does she think she's some kind of soldier or something?" Kevin glanced toward the windows where Grace worked, noting the way her shoulders had tensed slightly. He should have steered the conversation elsewhere, should have remembered the basic human decency his mother had tried to teach him. Instead, he found himself joining in. "Maybe she's playing dress-up," Kevin said, his voice loud enough to carry. "You know, living out some fantasy about being important." The laughter that followed felt like acid in Grace's chest. Her cleaning cloth moved in increasingly agitated circles on the already spotless glass as the words hit her like physical blows. "I bet she bought them at some army surplus store," Brad added, warming to the topic. "Probably never been within 50 miles of actual military service." Grace's hands began to tremble. The bottle of cleaning solution slipped slightly in her grip, and she had to steady herself against the window frame. In her mind, she was suddenly back at Camp Pendleton, standing in the base commander's office, receiving news that would split her life into before and after. "Ma'am, I regret to inform you that your son, Lance Corporal Marcus Washington, was killed during a training exercise." "Those boots are probably the most exciting thing in her life," Tyler continued, oblivious to the devastation he was causing just feet away. "Gives her something to feel special about while she empties our trash cans." The words hit Grace like shrapnel. Her vision blurred, and she gripped the window ledge to keep from falling. The boots on her feet, Marcus's boots, the ones he had saved his deployment money to buy for her as a coming-home gift, the ones that had been resold 3 times because she couldn't bear to replace them, suddenly felt like lead weights. Kevin watched Grace's reflection in the conference room's interior windows. He could see the way her body had gone rigid, the careful control in her movements that suggested she was fighting some internal battle. A flicker of conscience tried to surface, but he pushed it down. She was just cleaning staff. She was paid to be invisible. "Maybe we should," Kevin started to say, some buried part of his humanity trying to assert itself. "Maybe she thinks they make her look tougher," Danny interrupted, laughing harder now. "Like anyone's going to be intimidated by the cleaning lady." Grace closed her eyes for a moment, and suddenly she was 19 again, standing in the recruitment office in Englewood, signing papers that would take her away from the South Side and give her a chance at something better. She remembered the pride in her mother's eyes when she came home in uniform for the first time, remembered the letters Marcus had written from boot camp, telling her about the other Marines who looked up to her son because his mom was a veteran too. "I served so you could have opportunities one never had," she had told Marcus during his last visit home. "I want you to be proud of who you are, baby. Proud of where you come from." Now those same boots that had carried her through the mountains of Afghanistan, that had stood at attention during promotion ceremonies, that had walked her to her son's grave every month for the past 2 years, were being mocked by men who had never sacrificed anything more significant than a weekend for their careers. "You know what the funniest part is?" Brad said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "She probably thinks we don't notice. Like she's fooling someone with that whole military thing." The cleaning bottle finally slipped from Grace's trembling hands, hitting the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the hallway. The sound was so loud that even the executives paused in their conversation. Grace knelt quickly to pick up the pieces, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the broken plastic. One shard cut her palm, drawing a thin line of blood that dripped onto the pristine marble floor, the first mark she had ever left on their perfect world. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The voice came from behind her. Grace looked up to see a young woman in a red blazer and black slacks, one of the junior associates whose office she cleaned every morning. The woman's dark hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her expression showed genuine concern. "I'm fine," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just clumsy. Here, let me help." The woman, her nameplate read Rachel Martinez, knelt beside Grace, helping to gather the broken pieces. "Did you cut yourself?" Grace looked at her palm, where blood was still seeping from the small wound. "It's nothing serious. We should get you a Band-Aid at least." Rachel stood, then paused. "Those are beautiful boots, by the way. My grandfather was in Vietnam. He had a pair just like them." Grace's throat constricted. She managed a small nod, not trusting herself to speak. From inside the conference room, the conversation had resumed, but Kevin found himself distracted. He kept glancing toward the hallway where Grace was cleaning up the broken bottle, where that young associate was treating her with more kindness than his entire team had shown in months. "Kevin, you with us?" Brad's voice snapped him back to attention. "Yeah, sorry. Just thinking about the Henderson timeline." But Kevin wasn't thinking about Henderson Industries. He was thinking about the way Grace's hands had shaken, about the careful dignity with which she had knelt to clean up her mistake, about the fact that in 2 years of working in the same building, he had never once bothered to learn her name. As Grace finished cleaning the hallway and moved her cart toward the service elevator, Kevin caught one last glimpse of her reflection in the conference room's windows. She moved like someone carrying invisible weight, her military bearings still evident despite the cruel words that had just torn through her carefully maintained composure. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft chime, and Grace was gone. But the echo of the executive's laughter lingered in the air like smoke, and Kevin found himself wondering, for the first time in his corporate career, whether being right about business deals mattered if you were wrong about everything else. In the service elevator, Grace pressed her back against the cold metal wall and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to fall apart. 30 seconds to remember Marcus's face when he had presented her with the boots. 30 seconds to feel the full weight of being reduced to a punchline by people who would never understand what service meant. Then she straightened her shoulders, checked her reflection in the elevator's polished surface, and prepared to face the rest of her shift. Because no matter how much they mocked her, no matter how invisible they wanted her to be, she had work to do. The boots would carry her through this day, just as they had carried her through every day since Marcus died. They were her connection to him, to her service, to the woman she had been before grief tried to erase her. And tomorrow, she would lace them up again. The supply closet on the 37th floor had become Grace's sanctuary over the past 2 years. Tucked between the executive break room and the copy center, it was the one place in Meridian Financial Tower where she could exist without performance, without the careful choreography of invisibility that her job required. She sat on an overturned mop bucket, her back pressed against shelves lined with industrial cleaning supplies, and stared at the combat boots that had become the center of so much unwanted attention. Her hands still trembled from the conference room incident, and the small bandage Rachel had given her felt tight across her palm. Playing dress-up, living out some fantasy about being important. Kevin's words echoed in the cramped space, each repetition feeling like a fresh wound. Grace closed her eyes and tried to summon the breathing techniques her therapist at the VA had taught her, but the voices of those executives kept breaking through her concentration. She reached into her cleaning cart and pulled out the protective plastic sleeve containing Marcus's photograph. Even through the clear covering, his smile seemed to fill the small room with warmth. He was 22 in the picture, fresh out of boot camp, his dress blue uniform immaculate and his eyes bright with the kind of hope that only young Marines possessed. "They don't know, baby," she whispered to the photograph. "They don't know what these boots mean." But even as she said the words, doubt crept in like cold air through a cracked window. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was clinging to something that no longer belonged to her. Maybe wearing Marcus's boots to a janitor's job was a kind of fantasy, a desperate attempt to hold onto a version of herself that had died with her son. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Dr. Patricia Williams from the VA Medical Center. Grace, you missed our appointment yesterday. Are you okay? Please call me. Grace had been avoiding Dr. Williams for 3 weeks now, ever since their last session when the therapist had gently suggested that Grace might be stuck in her grief process. The phrase had felt like an accusation, as if missing Marcus was a character flaw she should overcome with sufficient effort. She typed back, "Sorry, work schedule changed. We'll reschedule soon." It was a lie. Her work schedule never changed. She arrived at 5 a.m. and left at 1 p.m., Monday through Friday, just as she had for 847 consecutive days. The routine was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world of the living. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in his corner office, Kevin stared out at Lake Michigan and tried to convince himself that the morning's conversation meant nothing. The Henderson presentation had gone perfectly. The board had approved the acquisition, and Kevin was already calculating his bonus percentage. Success should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt hollow. "Outstanding work on Henderson," Brad said, appearing in Kevin's doorway with a coffee and a satisfied grin. The old man looked impressed when you walked through those projections. "Thanks." Kevin's response was automatic, distracted. "You seem off today. Everything good?" Kevin turned from the window, his reflection ghosting across the glass. "Do you ever think about the cleaning staff?" Brad blinked, clearly thrown by the question. "What about them?" "I don't know. Their lives, I guess. What they do when they're not here." "Dude, where is this coming from?" Brad settled into one of Kevin's leather chairs, his expression shifting from confusion to mild concern. "Did something happen?" Kevin thought about Grace kneeling on the marble floor, gathering broken pieces while blood seeped from her palm. He thought about the way her shoulders had set when they were discussing her boots, the military precision in her movements even as she was falling apart. "That woman this morning. The janitor. I think we were too harsh." Brad's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Kevin, she's paid to clean. We're paid to think. That's how the world works. You can't start feeling guilty every time someone's feelings get hurt, or you'll never make it to executive VP." The words should have made sense. They were exactly the kind of pragmatic wisdom that had carried Kevin through business school and up the corporate ladder. But today they felt like stones in his stomach. "She seemed upset. She'll get over it. People like that always do." Brad stood, brushing invisible lint from his suit jacket. "Look, I get it. Sometimes you feel bad about being successful when other people aren't. But that's not your fault. You earned everything you have." After Brad left, Kevin tried to focus on his emails, but his concentration kept fracturing. He found himself Googling things he'd never thought about before: military service statistics, veteran employment rates, Gold Star families. The information he found painted a picture he'd never bothered to consider: a world of sacrifice and loss that existed parallel to his own comfortable reality. Back in the supply closet, Grace was fighting her own battle with reality. She had pulled her personal items from the cleaning cart: Marcus's photo, the folded flag from his funeral, and a small wooden box containing his dog tags and the Purple Heart he'd earned posthumously. These were the artifacts of a life that had mattered, proof that Marcus Washington had existed and served and died for something larger than himself. But sitting in a janitor's closet while executives mocked his memory made those artifacts feel suddenly fragile, like museum pieces from a war nobody remembered. Grace's phone rang. The caller ID showed her sister Denise's number, and Grace almost didn't answer. Denise had been calling more frequently lately, worried about Grace's isolation and what she called her unhealthy attachment to Marcus's things. "Hey, Dee," Grace answered, trying to inject normalcy into her voice. "Grace, thank God. I was starting to worry. How are you doing?" "I'm fine. Just working." "That's what you always say." Denise's voice carried the particular weariness of someone who had been trying to help for too long. "Dr. Williams called me. She said you've been missing appointments." Grace closed her eyes. "I don't need her telling me how to grieve my own son." "She's not telling you how to grieve. She's trying to help you live again." "I am living." Hiding in that building, cleaning up after people who don't even see you as human, that's not living, Grace. That's just surviving. The accusation stung because it contained too much truth. Grace had been surviving, getting through each day by making herself as small and invisible as possible. The boots were the only part of her old self she'd been brave enough to keep. "Marcus would want you to be happy," Denise continued, her voice gentle but insistent. "He wouldn't want you to disappear into that job." "These people today," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper, "they were making fun of his boots, calling me a fake, saying I was playing dress-up." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Oh, honey," Denise finally said. "I'm so sorry. But maybe it's time to consider that wearing those boots to work might not be the healthiest way to honor Marcus's memory." Grace felt something inside her recoil. "They're all I have left of him." "No, they're not. You have your memories, your love, the pride you felt when he enlisted. You have the woman who raised a son brave enough to serve his country. Those boots don't make you who you are, Grace. They never did." After the call ended, Grace sat in the supply closet staring at the boots that had defined her identity for the past 2 years. For the first time since Marcus's death, she allowed herself to imagine taking them off. The thought felt like betrayal, but it also felt like something else, something that might have been relief. She thought about Rachel Martinez, who had treated her with kindness without knowing anything about her military service. She thought about Tony at the security desk, who asked about his daughter because he cared, not because he was impressed by her footwear. Maybe Denise was right. Maybe the boots had become a crutch, a way of clinging to a version of herself that no longer existed. Maybe honoring Marcus meant more than wearing his gifts until they fell apart. But as Grace looked at her reflection in the supply closet's small mirror, she saw a woman who had already lost too much. The boots were her connection to a time when she had mattered, when she had been somebody worth respecting. Without them, she was just another invisible worker in a building full of people who would never see her as anything more than a function. She laced the boots tighter and returned to work. 3 floors below, Kevin was making his own decision about resistance. He had opened his laptop to compose an email to HR about workplace sensitivity training, but the cursor blinked mockingly on the empty screen. What would he say? That his team had hurt someone's feelings? That they had committed the corporate sin of noticing the help? Instead, he closed the laptop and told himself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he would be more aware, more considerate. Tomorrow he would be better. But tomorrow felt abstract and distant, while the memory of Grace's trembling hands felt immediate and real. Kevin realized that resistance came in many forms, and choosing to do nothing was its own kind of choice. Outside the supply closet, the rest of Meridian Financial Tower continued its relentless pursuit of profit, oblivious to the parallel struggles happening in its shadows. Grace finished her shift with mechanical precision, her boots echoing through empty hallways like a countdown timer nobody could hear. The building would sleep tonight, but neither Grace nor Kevin would rest easily. Some wounds cut too deep for simple resistance, and some truths demand more than good intentions to heal. Thursday afternoon brought the kind of October storm that turned Chicago's streets into rivers and sent office workers scrambling for their umbrellas. Grace had just finished cleaning the 35th floor when the first rumble of thunder shook the windows of Meridian Financial Tower. She glanced outside at the darkening sky, calculating whether she could finish the executive floors before the worst of it hit. The elevator chimed softly as she pushed her cart inside, pressing the button for 37. The familiar weight of Marcus's boots felt heavier today. She'd spent the previous evening sitting on her apartment floor, holding them in her lap, trying to decide if Denise was right about letting go. But morning had come, and she'd laced them up again, unable to face the world without their familiar comfort. Kevin Mitchell was having his own difficult day. The Henderson deal had officially closed that morning, which should have been cause for celebration. Instead, he found himself distracted during the signing ceremony, his mind wandering to conversations he couldn't shake and a face he kept seeing in reflections. He'd stayed late to catch up on emails, hoping the work would crowd out the uncomfortable thoughts that had been following him around like shadows. The elevator was rising past the 29th floor when the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The car lurched to a stop with a grinding sound that seemed to echo from the building's mechanical heart. In the sudden darkness, Grace's military training kicked in immediately. She reached into her cleaning cart and pulled out the heavy-duty flashlight she always carried. Old habits from Afghanistan, where darkness could be the difference between life and death. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing Kevin pressed against the elevator's back wall, his usually perfect composure cracking at the edges. "Power outage," Grace said calmly, playing the flashlight across the elevator's control panel. All the buttons were dark, probably from the storm. Kevin's breathing was shallow, almost panicked. How long do these things usually last? Grace studied his face in the flashlight's glow. She'd seen that look before, the wide eyes, the tight jaw, the careful control barely masking terror. It was the same expression she'd worn during her first rocket attack in Kandahar, before experience taught her the difference between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear. "Depends on what caused it," she said, keeping her voice steady and professional. "Could be a few minutes, could be longer. The building has backup generators, but they don't always kick in for the elevators right away." Lightning flashed outside, visible through the small gap between the elevator doors, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the entire building. Kevin flinched, his hands gripping the elevator rail. "Are you claustrophobic?" Grace asked, genuine concern in her voice. Kevin's laugh was bitter and embarrassed. "Apparently. I never knew until right now." He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, leaving it disheveled for the first time since Grace had known him. "This is ridiculous. I'm 34 years old." Grace positioned her flashlight so it provided ambient light without shining directly in Kevin's eyes. Another skill from her military days, when preserving night vision could save lives. "Fear doesn't care how old you are. I've seen grown Marines panic over smaller things than this." "You were in the military?" Kevin's question came out sharper than he intended, surprise cutting through his anxiety. Grace hesitated. She'd spent 2 years making herself invisible, avoiding personal conversations that might complicate her carefully constructed anonymity. But trapped in an elevator with a frightened man seemed like the wrong time for maintaining professional distance. 3 tours, she said quietly. Afghanistan. Communications specialist. Kevin stared at her in the flashlight's soft glow, Pieces of a puzzle he'd never tried to solve suddenly clicking into place. The military bearing that he'd dismissed as pretension, the quiet competence she brought to every task, the boots that had seemed so out of place in a corporate environment, it all made sense now. "I owe you an apology," he said suddenly. Grace's hand tightened on the flashlight. "For what?" "Tuesday morning. The conference room. I heard what we said about your boots, about—" Kevin's voice trailed off as he realized how much worse the truth sounded when spoken aloud. "I'm sorry. We were cruel and ignorant, and I should have stopped it." The elevator's emergency phone was mounted near the control panel, and Grace reached for it, checking for a dial tone. "Dead. Cell service?" she asked. Kevin pulled out his iPhone, squinting at the screen. "No signal. We're probably too deep in the building's core." Grace nodded, settling her back against the elevator wall with the practiced patience of someone who'd spent long hours waiting in uncomfortable places. "Then we wait. Building maintenance will know the elevator's stuck. They'll get us out. How can you be so calm about this?" Kevin asked, sliding down the wall to sit on the elevator floor. His expensive suit would be wrinkled, but he seemed beyond caring about such details. "Because panicking won't change anything," Grace said simply. "I learned that lesson in a lot worse places than this." Kevin studied her face in the flashlight's glow. Without the harsh fluorescent lights of the office, without the context of her cleaning uniform and cart, she looked different. Stronger, more present, like someone whose opinion might actually matter. "What was it like?" he asked. "Afghanistan." Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth to share with a man who'd mocked her just days earlier. But something about the darkness, about their shared vulnerability, made honesty feel safer than it had in months. "Hot," she said finally. "And dusty. And scary in ways that don't make sense until you're there." She paused, remembering. "But also beautiful sometimes. The mountains at sunrise, the way people could still find reasons to laugh even when everything was falling apart." "Did you see combat?" "I was communications. My job was to make sure people could talk to each other when talking meant the difference between getting home and getting killed." Grace shifted the flashlight to her other hand. "But in Afghanistan, everyone sees combat eventually. The war doesn't care what your job description says." Kevin nodded, even though he had no frame of reference for understanding what she'd experienced. "Is that why you wear the boots?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Grace felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the reflexive urge to deflect and retreat. But Kevin's voice held genuine curiosity rather than mockery, and she found herself wanting to trust it. "They belong to my son," she said quietly. "Marcus. He bought them for me as a homecoming gift when I finished my last tour. Said his mom deserved boots as tough as she was." "Belonged." Kevin's voice was careful, gentle. "He died 2 years ago. Training accident at Camp Pendleton." Grace's voice remained steady, but Kevin could see the way her free hand clenched into a fist. "He was 22. Just a baby, really." The silence that followed felt different from the awkward pauses that had characterized their previous interactions. It was the kind of silence that held space for grief, for the weight of loss that couldn't be measured in words. "I'm sorry," Kevin said, and meant it in a way that surprised him. "I can't imagine." "No," Grace agreed. "You can't. But that's okay. I hope you never have to." Thunder rolled overhead again, and the building's emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in a dim red glow. Kevin looked around the elevator as if seeing it for the first time, The polished steel walls, the expensive fixtures, the small space that had somehow become a confessional. "My father died 6 months ago," he said suddenly. "Heart attack. I was in a meeting when it happened, and I almost didn't leave to go to the hospital because I thought the client would be upset about rescheduling." Grace turned to look at him more directly. "Did you make it in time?" "No. He was gone before I got there." Kevin's voice was hollow. "The last thing I said to him was that I was too busy to come to dinner on Sunday. Too busy to spend time with a man who worked 2 jobs to put me through college." "Grief makes us do things that don't make sense," Grace said gently. "Even to ourselves. Is that what this is?" Kevin gestured vaguely at their surroundings, at the strange intimacy of their trapped situation. "Grief. Maybe. Or maybe it's just 2 people finally seeing each other clearly." The elevator lurched suddenly, and the lights flickered back to full brightness. The control panel chimed, and the car began rising smoothly toward the 37th floor. As they approached their destination, Grace gathered her cleaning supplies and Kevin straightened his tie, both of them preparing to return to their assigned roles. But something had shifted in the darkness, some invisible barrier had cracked, and neither of them was quite the same person who had entered the elevator 20 minutes earlier. The doors opened with their usual soft chime, revealing the familiar marble hallway of the executive floor. Grace pushed her cart out first, then turned back to Kevin, who remained standing in the elevator as if uncertain about his next move. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping me calm, for sharing your story." Grace nodded. "Thank you for listening." As the elevator doors closed between them, both Grace and Kevin realized that some conversations change you in ways that can't be undone. The forced proximity had stripped away their careful masks, revealing the human beings underneath. Flawed, grieving, more alike than either had imagined possible. Grace continued down the hallway, her boots clicking against the marble with their familiar rhythm. But for the first time in months, the sound didn't echo with loneliness. Someone had heard her story and hadn't turned away. And in his corner office, Kevin sat at his desk staring out at the storm, thinking about sacrifice and service and the weight of boots he'd never understood. The Henderson merger documents sat forgotten on his desk, less important suddenly than the question of how to be worthy of the grace he'd been shown by a woman he'd spent 2 years failing to see. The storm was passing, but its effects would linger long after the skies cleared. The bracelet fell from Grace's cleaning cart like a whispered secret hitting marble floor. It was Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the elevator incident, and Kevin had been watching for Grace's arrival with an anticipation that surprised him. He'd spent the previous evening researching veteran support organizations, trying to understand a world he'd never bothered to consider. The websites were filled with statistics about unemployment, homelessness, and suicide rates that made his comfortable problems seem insignificant. Now, as Grace knelt to retrieve the fallen bracelet, Kevin saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. The bracelet was simple, black leather cord threaded with small metal charms. But one of those charms was unmistakably a purple heart medal, no bigger than a quarter, its distinctive purple and gold enamel catching the morning light. "Excuse me," Kevin said, stepping out of his office before he could second-guess himself. "You dropped something." Grace looked up from where she was reaching under a decorative plant stand, her face flushing with embarrassment. "Thank you. It's nothing important." But Kevin had already seen what it was, and the sight of that tiny purple heart had unlocked a memory he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. Suddenly, he was 8 years old again, standing in his grandfather's study in Milwaukee, staring at a display case filled with military medals. His grandfather, Patrick Mitchell, had served in Korea but rarely talked about it. The only time Kevin had seen the old man cry was when a news report about a soldier's funeral came on television. "That's a Purple Heart," Kevin said quietly, recognizing the distinctive metal on Grace's bracelet. Grace's hand closed around the bracelet protectively. "Yes. My grandfather had one. From Korea." Kevin's voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. He said it was the medal no one wanted to earn. Grace stood slowly, the bracelet clutched in her palm. For a moment, she seemed to be deciding something, weighing risks and possibilities in the silence between them. "It was Marcus's," she said finally. "He earned it posthumously." The word posthumously hit Kevin like a physical blow. He'd known her son was dead. She'd told him that much in the elevator, but somehow the clinical terminology made it more real, more final. "The training accident," Kevin said, remembering. "Not an accident." Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "That's what I told you because it's easier than the truth. Marcus died by suicide, 3 days after coming home from his second deployment." The hallway seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Kevin felt something inside his chest crack open, a kind of pain he'd never experienced before, the pain of recognizing suffering so profound it redefined what suffering meant. "Grace, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. How could you?" Grace's voice wasn't accusatory, just tired. "I don't talk about it. Ever. Even at the VA, I stick to the training accident story. It's easier for everyone." She looked down at the bracelet in her hand, and Kevin could see years of grief compressed into the way her fingers traced the small metal. "The boots," Kevin said, understanding flooding through him. "They're not just from your service. Marcus bought them for me during his first deployment. Saved his combat pay for 3 months to afford them." Grace's voice took on the careful cadence of someone reciting facts to avoid drowning in emotion. "He said when he got home, we'd go hiking together. Said his mom deserved boots tough enough to keep up with a Marine." Kevin thought about the conference room conversation, about the casual cruelty of his colleagues' laughter, about how completely wrong they'd all been about everything. But he never made it home from that second deployment, did he? Kevin asked gently. Grace shook her head. 22 months in Afghanistan. 2 tours. He came back different. Quieter, more serious. The VA said it was adjustment disorder, maybe some PTSD. They prescribed medication, scheduled counseling sessions. She paused, her breath catching. "I thought we were managing it." Kevin found himself leaning against the wall, needing support as the weight of Grace's story settled on him. "What happened?" "I was working a double shift at the hospital. This was before I took the job here. Marcus called me around midnight, said he was having trouble sleeping, having bad dreams. I told him to try the breathing exercises his therapist had taught him, that we'd talk more when I got home." Grace's voice cracked slightly. "I was tired, Kevin. I'd been working 16-hour shifts to pay for his college classes, and I was just tired." The hallway felt impossibly quiet. Kevin could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the distant hum of the building's ventilation system, could hear Grace's careful breathing as she fought to maintain control. "I found him the next morning when I got off shift. He was wearing his dress blues, sitting in his old bedroom, the same room he'd had since he was 10. There was a note." Kevin's throat felt tight. What did it say? That he was sorry. That he couldn't stop seeing the faces of the people who died because of his mistakes. That he didn't want to be a burden to me anymore. Grace looked up at Kevin, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He called me his hero in that note. Said I'd sacrificed enough for his dreams. Kevin thought about his own father, about missed dinners and postponed conversations, about all the ways he'd taken love for granted. But even his regrets felt small compared to the ocean of grief Grace was describing. The boots were in his closet, Grace continued. Still in the box, still wrapped in tissue paper. He'd been saving them for when he felt ready to take that hiking trip we'd planned. I found them 3 days after the funeral, along with a card that said, "For the strongest woman I know." Kevin felt tears he hadn't cried since childhood burning behind his eyes. So you wear them to remember him. I wear them because they're the only part of our future that still exists, Grace said simply. Every morning when I lace them up, I remember that he thought I was strong enough to keep going. Some days, that's the only thing that gets me out of bed. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet they'd shared in the elevator. This was the silence of witnessing something sacred, of being trusted with a story so personal that sharing it was an act of faith. "Why are you telling me this?" Kevin asked quietly. Grace considered the question, still holding the bracelet with its small purple heart charm. "Because you listened. In the elevator, when I told you about Marcus, you didn't try to fix it or explain it away. You just listened. Most people can't do that." Kevin thought about the listening skills they taught him in business school. Active listening, strategic questioning, reading body language for negotiation advantages. All of it seemed like performance art compared to the simple act of witnessing someone else's truth without trying to reshape it. "I don't know how to help," he admitted. "You can't. That's not how grief works." Grace clipped the bracelet back onto her wrist, where it settled against her skin like a prayer. "But you can remember that the people around you are carrying stories you know nothing about. You can remember that every person you meet is fighting battles you can't see." Kevin nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood yet what that kind of remembering would require of him. "I need to get back to work," Grace said, reaching for her cleaning cart. "Thank you for listening. Again." As Grace moved down the hallway, her boots marking their familiar rhythm against the marble, Kevin stood motionless, processing everything he'd just learned. The purple heart bracelet, the suicide, the boots that represented hope instead of history. It was too much information, too much pain, too much reality for the sanitized world of Meridian Financial Tower. But it was also the truth, and Kevin realized that most of his life had been spent carefully avoiding truths that might complicate his comfortable assumptions about the world. He returned to his office and sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen without seeing it. Outside his windows, Chicago moved through another ordinary Friday morning. Traffic flowing, people hurrying to meetings, life proceeding as if the conversation in the hallway hadn't just rewritten everything Kevin thought he knew about courage and loss and the weight of other people's stories. For the first time in his corporate career, Kevin Mitchell had no idea what to do with information that couldn't be converted into profit margins or strategic advantages. Grace Washington had just handed him a piece of her heart, and he had absolutely no framework for understanding what that meant or what he was supposed to do with it. All he knew was that he would never look at those desert tan combat boots the same way again. The following Monday morning brought an unseasonable warmth to Chicago, the kind of October heat that made people shed their jackets and remember that winter wasn't inevitable. Grace arrived at Meridian Financial Tower at her usual 5 a.m., but something felt different as she badged through security. Tony looked up from his desk with a broader smile than usual. "Morning, Mrs. Washington. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It is," Grace agreed, though she wondered if Tony could sense the shift in her own mood. Friday's conversation with Kevin had left her feeling lighter somehow, as if sharing Marcus's story had redistributed the weight she'd been carrying alone. The elevator ride to the 37th floor felt different too. Instead of the familiar dread that had accompanied her morning routine for months, Grace found herself curious about what the day might bring. She'd spent the weekend thinking about Kevin's reaction to Marcus's Purple Heart, about the genuine sorrow in his eyes when she'd told him the truth about her son's death. Kevin was already at his desk when Grace reached the executive floor, which surprised her. In 2 years of working the same schedule, she'd never seen him arrive before 7:30 a.m. Through his office's glass walls, she could see him hunched over his laptop, a coffee cup steaming beside a stack of papers. He looked up as she passed with her cleaning cart, and their eyes met through the glass. Instead of the usual polite nod or distracted glance, Kevin raised his hand in a small wave. Grace found herself smiling back before she could question the impulse. An hour later, as Grace was organizing her supplies in the break room, Kevin appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. "I wasn't sure how you take it," he said, offering her one of the cups. "So I brought sugar and cream packets." Grace accepted the coffee with surprise. It was from the expensive machine in the executive break room, the kind of coffee she'd never felt entitled to taste despite refilling it every morning for 2 years. "Thank you," she said, adding 1 sugar packet and stirring slowly. "This is very kind." Kevin settled into one of the break room chairs, an action so unprecedented that Grace wondered if she was dreaming. Executives didn't sit in the staff break room. They certainly didn't drink coffee with the cleaning staff. "I've been thinking about what you told me," Kevin said. "About Marcus, about everything. I realize I don't know anything about your life outside this building." Grace sat across from him, the coffee warming her hands. "There's not much to know. I work, I go home. I visit Marcus's grave on Sundays. It's not very exciting." "Where is he buried?" "Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery in Elwood, about an hour south of here." Grace's voice softened. "It's peaceful there. Lots of trees. Very quiet. Marcus always loved quiet places." Kevin nodded, filing away this information as if it mattered to him personally. "Do you have other family in Chicago?" "My sister Denise lives in Evanston. She's a nurse at Northwestern Memorial. We talk every few days, though she worries about me too much." Grace sipped her coffee, surprised by how easy this conversation felt. "What about you? Do you have family here?" "My parents are both gone now. Dad died 6 months ago. Mom passed when I was in college." Kevin's voice carried the particular sadness of someone still learning to navigate the world without parental safety nets. "No siblings, no wife, no kids. Just me and my career." "That sounds lonely," Grace said gently. Kevin looked at her with surprise, as if no one had ever named his loneliness so directly. "It is, sometimes. I tell myself I'm too busy for relationships, but the truth is I don't know how to connect with people anymore. Everything in my world is transactional." Grace studied his face, noting the way his shoulders had relaxed since sitting down, the way his usual corporate mask had slipped to reveal something more human underneath. Marcus used to say that the hardest part about coming home from deployment wasn't the nightmares or the crowds, she said. It was remembering how to have conversations that didn't serve a purpose. How to talk to people just because you enjoyed their company. "Is that what we're doing?" Kevin asked. "Talking just because we enjoy it?" Grace considered this. "I think so. It's been a long time since I've had a conversation that wasn't about work or grief or doctor's appointments. This feels normal." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee while the building slowly came to life around them. Grace could hear the distant chime of elevators, the soft hum of computers booting up, the gradual increase in voices as early arrivals began their workdays. "Can I ask you something?" Kevin said. "And please tell me if I'm overstepping." Grace nodded. "Why do you work here? I mean, with your military background, your experience, surely there are better opportunities available." Grace had been asked this question before, by Denise, by Dr. Williams, by well-meaning people who couldn't understand why a veteran would choose custodial work in a corporate tower. She'd developed standard answers about flexible hours and steady income, responses that were true but incomplete. "After Marcus died, I couldn't handle complexity," she said honestly. "The job I had before, I was a communications coordinator at a logistics company, managing multiple projects, dealing with deadlines and client demands. When Marcus died, I couldn't concentrate. I'd start crying in meetings, forget important details, lose track of conversations mid-sentence." Kevin listened without interrupting, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "This job is simple," Grace continued. "The tasks are clear, the results are immediate. I clean something and it becomes clean. There's no ambiguity, no interpretation required. At the end of each day, I can see exactly what I've accomplished." "But you're overqualified for it." "Maybe. But it's what I need right now. Or what I needed when I started. I'm not sure anymore." Kevin set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "What would you do if you could do anything? If money and qualifications and grief weren't factors?" The question caught Grace off guard. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked her about her dreams rather than her limitations. "I used to think about teaching," she said slowly. "When Marcus was little, I'd help him with his homework, and I loved watching him understand new concepts. In the military, I did a lot of training for new communications personnel. There's something satisfying about helping people develop skills they didn't know they had." "What would you teach?" "Maybe computer skills for veterans transitioning to civilian jobs. Basic things like email and spreadsheets and online applications. So many of the guys I knew from Afghanistan struggle with that stuff, and it keeps them from finding decent work." Kevin's expression had changed as Grace talked, shifting from polite interest to genuine engagement. "That's a great idea. There's definitely a need for that kind of program." "It's just a dream," Grace said, suddenly self-conscious about sharing something so personal. "I don't have the credentials to run a program like that." "You have military experience, communications training, and first-hand knowledge of what veterans need. That's more relevant than most credentials." Grace looked at Kevin with new curiosity. "Why are you encouraging this?" Kevin paused, considering his answer. "Because I've spent my entire career around people who gave up on their dreams to chase money and status. It's refreshing to meet someone who still has dreams, even if she thinks they're impossible." "What about your dreams?" Grace asked. "What did you want to be before you became a corporate executive?" Kevin laughed, but it wasn't entirely happy. "You'll think this is ridiculous, but I wanted to be a history teacher. I loved stories about how ordinary people shaped historical events. I wanted to help kids understand that history wasn't just dates and names. It was real people making difficult choices." "What happened?" "Business school happened. Student loans happened. The promise of financial security happened." Kevin shrugged. "I told myself I'd teach later, after I'd made enough money to feel safe. But later keeps moving further away." Grace studied his face, seeing something in his expression that reminded her of Marcus during his last visit home, the look of someone who'd lost track of who they used to be. "It's not too late," she said quietly. "You're only 34, says the woman who thinks she's too old to teach computer skills to veterans. They smiled at each other, recognizing the mutual absurdity of their self-imposed limitations. "Maybe we're both selling ourselves short," Grace said. "Maybe we are." Kevin's phone buzzed with a meeting reminder, breaking the spell of their conversation. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "I have to prep for a client call." "And I have 36 more floors to clean," Grace said, standing and gathering her supplies. As they walked toward the break room door, Kevin stopped. "Grace, would you like to have coffee again tomorrow? Same time." Grace felt something flutter in her chest, not romantic attraction, but something equally rare in her recent experience, the possibility of friendship. "I'd like that," she said. As Kevin disappeared into his office and Grace returned to her cleaning cart, both of them carried something new through their morning routines. For Grace, it was the unfamiliar warmth of being seen as more than her grief. For Kevin, it was the strange comfort of talking to someone who cared more about his dreams than his portfolio. Neither of them recognized it yet, but they had just taken the first steps toward healing wounds they'd been carrying alone for too long. The coffee had been simple, the conversation ordinary, but sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest gestures of human connection. Outside the windows of Meridian Financial Tower, Chicago continued its relentless pace, unaware that on the 37th floor, two unlikely people had just discovered that loneliness was not a permanent sentence. It was simply a condition waiting for the right person to notice it needed healing. 3 weeks had passed since that first morning coffee, and Grace found herself looking forward to work in a way that surprised her. The daily conversations with Kevin had become the brightest part of her routine, 20 minutes of genuine connection before the building filled with people who still saw her as invisible furniture. They talked about everything: Kevin's memories of his grandfather's war stories, Grace's plans for a veteran computer literacy program, books they'd read, places they'd traveled, dreams they'd buried and were slowly excavating. Grace had even shown Kevin photos of Marcus as a child, gap-toothed and grinning in his Little League uniform, serious and proud at his high school graduation. But what Grace didn't know was that their friendship had become the subject of increasingly uncomfortable conversations among Kevin's colleagues. It started with Brad noticing Kevin arriving earlier and staying later in the break room. Then Tyler spotted them through the glass walls, sitting across from each other like equals rather than executive and service employee. The gossip spread through the 37th floor like spilled coffee, staining everything it touched. "He's having coffee with the janitor lady," Danny whispered to a group of associates during lunch. "Every morning. They sit there talking like they're old friends or something." "That's weird, right?" asked Jennifer Walsh from accounting. "I mean, what could they possibly have to talk about?" The questions followed Kevin through his days like shadows, but he ignored them. For the first time in years, he was having conversations that mattered more than profit margins and market share. Grace had become his friend, the first real friend he'd had since college, and he wasn't about to apologize for that. But Meridian Financial's annual holiday party was approaching, and with it, the kind of social pressures that could turn whispered gossip into public confrontation. The party was held on the Friday before Thanksgiving in the building's penthouse conference room, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Chicago's skyline. The guest list included all senior executives, major clients, and select staff members, a carefully curated gathering designed to reinforce the company's hierarchy while celebrating another profitable year. Grace wasn't invited, of course. She would work her regular shift, cleaning around the party preparations and leaving before the festivities began. But as she organized supplies in the break room that morning, she could hear the excitement in the building. Caterers arriving, decorators hanging lights, executives discussing their holiday plans. Kevin found her there at their usual time, but something was different about his demeanor. He seemed distracted, checking his phone more frequently than usual, his responses to her stories coming a beat too late. "Everything okay?" Grace asked, noticing the tension in his shoulders. "Just work stress," Kevin said, but his smile felt forced. "The party tonight has everyone on edge. Big clients flying in, major donors to impress. You know how it is." Grace nodded, though she didn't really know how it was. She'd never been to a corporate holiday party, never had to worry about impressing donors or managing client relationships. Her world was simpler, cleaner, literally and figuratively. "Will you be there late?" she asked. "Probably. These things tend to go until midnight or later." Kevin paused, then added, "I wish you could come. You'd probably have more interesting things to say than most of the people on the guest list." Grace laughed softly. "I don't think a janitor would fit in very well at your holiday party." "You're not just a janitor," Kevin said, his voice more serious than she expected. "You're one of the smartest, most interesting people I know." The compliment warmed Grace in a way she hadn't felt since Marcus was alive. Someone saw her as more than her job title, more than her grief, more than the circumstances that had brought her to Meridian Financial Tower. But Kevin's phone buzzed with another message, and when he glanced at it, his expression darkened. "I should get going," he said abruptly, standing and leaving his half-finished coffee behind. "Client meeting prep." Grace watched him leave, noting the way his shoulders had tensed again, the way he avoided eye contact as he said goodbye. Something was wrong, but she couldn't identify what. The day passed normally until evening, when Grace was finishing her rounds on the 35th floor. She could hear music and laughter from the penthouse, the sounds of celebration filtering down through the building's ventilation system. She tried not to think about Kevin up there, surrounded by his colleagues and clients, inhabiting a world she would never be part of. But as she was gathering her cleaning supplies, she realized she'd left her favorite microfiber cloths in the executive break room. The party was in full swing 3 floors above, so the 37th floor should be deserted. She could quickly retrieve the cloths and finish her shift without disturbing anyone. The elevator opened onto the executive floor, which was indeed empty except for the ambient lighting that stayed on overnight. Grace made her way to the break room, found her cloths, and was heading back toward the elevator when she heard voices coming from the penthouse stairwell. Someone had opened the door between floors, probably for fresh air or a private conversation. Grace should have continued walking, should have minded her own business and gone home. But she heard Kevin's voice among the others, and something in his tone, defensive, uncomfortable, made her pause. "Come on, Kevin," Brad's voice carried clearly down the stairwell. "We're just curious about your new friendship. It's not every day we see a senior VP having coffee dates with the help." Grace's blood turned cold. She pressed herself against the wall, hidden in the shadows between the elevator and the stairwell door, but unable to stop herself from listening. "It's not a big deal," Kevin said, his voice tight. "We just talk sometimes." "About what?" Tyler's voice was slurred with alcohol and amusement. "What could she possibly say that would interest someone like you?" Grace felt her stomach drop. This was the conversation she'd always dreaded, the one that would remind Kevin of the gulf between their worlds. "She's a person, Tyler. People have interesting stories." "She's the cleaning lady," Danny chimed in. "And a weird one at that, with those ridiculous boots. What is she trying to prove, anyway?" Grace's hand moved instinctively to her feet, where Marcus's combat boots suddenly felt heavy as anchors. "Look," Brad said, his voice taking on the tone of someone offering friendly advice. "We get it. Sometimes you feel sorry for the little people. It's natural. But you're about to be named Executive VP, Kevin. You can't afford to be seen as someone who doesn't understand appropriate boundaries. What's that supposed to mean? Kevin asked. It means, Jennifer Walsh's voice joined the conversation, sharp with corporate gossip, that the partners are already talking. They're wondering if you have the judgment necessary for executive leadership. Fraternizing with service staff sends the wrong message about your priorities. Grace felt as if she were watching a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away as the voices above destroyed everything she'd begun to hope for. She's not just service staff, Kevin said, but his voice lacked conviction. She's a veteran. She served 3 tours in Afghanistan. So what? Tyler laughed. Half the security guards in this building are probably veterans. That doesn't make them boardroom material. Grace closed her eyes, remembering every story she'd shared with Kevin, every moment of vulnerability she'd offered. Had he been collecting her experiences like interesting anecdotes to share with his colleagues? Besides, Brad continued, you know what they're really saying, right? About why a guy like you would suddenly be so interested in spending time with a middle-aged black cleaning lady. The silence that followed was thick with implication. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding exactly what Brad was suggesting without him having to say it explicitly. That's disgusting, Kevin said, but his voice was weak, defensive rather than outraged. Is it? Jennifer asked. Because from where we're standing, it looks pretty suspicious. Successful white executive, lonely older black woman, it's not hard to connect the dots. Grace wanted to run, to disappear before she heard Kevin's response. But her feet felt rooted to the floor, waiting for him to defend her, to defend their friendship, to prove that the past 3 weeks had meant something real. Look, Kevin said finally, and Grace could hear him choosing his words carefully. I was just being kind. She seemed lonely, and I felt bad about some things we'd said earlier. But you're right. It's probably gone too far. The words hit Grace like physical blows. Being kind. Felt bad. As if their conversations had been charity, as if her stories about Marcus and her dreams of teaching had been nothing more than Kevin's attempt to assuage his guilt. Smart man, Brad said approvingly. You had us worried there for a minute. Yeah, well, Kevin's laugh was hollow and bitter. I got carried away. It won't happen again. Good, Tyler said. Because between you and me, some of the clients were starting to notice. Henderson specifically asked about your unusual staffing relationships during dinner. Grace heard footsteps moving away from the stairwell door, voices fading as the group returned to the party. She stood in the shadows for several minutes, processing what she'd just heard, feeling the careful walls she'd built around her heart crumbling into dust. It won't happen again. The words echoed in her mind as she made her way to the elevator, as she rode down to the parking garage, as she walked the 12 blocks home to her empty apartment in Pilsen. Kevin had reduced their friendship to a mistake, their conversations to an embarrassment, her trust to something he needed to apologize for. Grace sat on her couch that night, still wearing Marcus's boots, staring at the photo of her son in his dress blues. For 3 weeks, she'd allowed herself to believe that someone saw her as more than her grief, more than her circumstances. She'd started to imagine a future that included friendship, possibly even the veteran computer program they'd discussed. Now she felt foolish for hoping, naive for trusting, stupid for believing that a man like Kevin Mitchell could ever see her as an equal rather than a charity case. But more than anything, she felt alone. More alone than she'd been since the day she found Marcus in his childhood bedroom, more alone than she'd thought possible for someone still breathing. Outside her apartment windows, Chicago glittered with holiday lights and the promise of celebration. But inside, Grace Washington sat in darkness, wondering how she would face Monday morning and the man who had just reminded her that some walls exist for good reason. The boots that had carried her through 3 tours of duty, through the worst day of her life, through 2 years of grief and healing, suddenly felt like the heaviest things she'd ever worn. The weekend stretched before Grace like an endless gray corridor. She sat in her Pilsen apartment on Saturday morning, still in her pajamas at noon, staring at Marcus's combat boots where she'd left them by the front door. For the first time in 851 days, she hadn't put them on. Her phone buzzed with messages she ignored. 3 texts from Denise asking about Thanksgiving plans. A voicemail from Dr. Williams at the VA wondering why she'd missed another appointment. Even a cheerful message from Tony at Building Security, asking if she was feeling okay since she'd seemed upset leaving work Friday night. But nothing from Kevin. Not that she'd expected anything. Grace replayed the overheard conversation obsessively, each word cutting deeper with repetition. "I was just being kind. It won't happen again." The dismissive tone, the easy laughter, the casual way he'd reduced their friendship to a mistake in judgment. She thought about calling in sick on Monday, avoiding the inevitable awkwardness of their first encounter since his betrayal. But Grace Washington had never run from anything in her life. Not poverty, not war, not grief, not the daily humiliation of being invisible in a building full of people who thought they mattered more than she did. On Sunday, she drove to Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery as always, parking in the same spot she'd used every week for 2 years. Marcus's headstone was simple white marble, engraved with his name, dates, rank, and the words, "Beloved Son and Marine." Grace usually spent an hour there, talking to Marcus about her week, updating him on small victories and daily struggles. But today she just sat in her car in the parking lot, unable to make herself walk to his grave. How could she tell Marcus that she'd been stupid enough to trust someone again? How could she admit that she'd let her guard down and been reminded, once again, that grief made people vulnerable in ways they couldn't protect themselves from? A light snow began falling, the first of the season, coating the cemetery's carefully maintained grounds in pristine white. Grace watched other visitors come and go, elderly women with flowers, young families with children, a man in a wheelchair placing a small flag beside a headstone. Everyone seemed to know their purpose, to belong in this place of remembrance. But Grace felt like an imposter, like someone who'd forgotten how to grieve properly. For 3 weeks, she'd been distracted by friendship and possibility, allowing hope to dilute the pure focus of her mourning. Maybe this was punishment for trying to move forward when Marcus was still so present in her thoughts. Her phone rang. "Denise." "Grace, thank God. I've been worried sick. Are you okay?" "I'm fine." Grace's voice sounded hollow even to herself. "You don't sound fine. Where are you?" "At the cemetery." Denise was quiet for a moment. "Honey, it's Sunday afternoon. You usually visit in the morning." "I couldn't get out of the car." "What happened?" Grace closed her eyes, watching snowflakes melt against her windshield. "I thought I had a friend. I was wrong. The man from work. The one you mentioned a few weeks ago." Grace had made the mistake of telling Denise about Kevin during one of their regular phone calls, describing him as someone who actually listens. Now that description felt like evidence of her own pathetic desperation for connection. "It doesn't matter. It's over. Grace, talk to me. What happened?" Grace found herself telling Denise everything. The coffee conversations, the shared stories, the growing sense that maybe she could have a life beyond cleaning buildings and visiting graves. Then she described Friday night's overheard conversation, Kevin's casual dismissal of their friendship, the crushing realization that she'd been a charity case all along. When she finished, Denise was quiet for a long time. "Grace," her sister said finally, "did it ever occur to you that maybe this man was pressured into saying those things? That maybe he didn't mean them?" "Of course he meant them. You should have heard his voice, Dee. He was embarrassed by me. Or he was embarrassed by his colleague's reaction. There's a difference." Grace felt a flicker of something. Not hope, exactly, but curiosity. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes good people make bad choices when they're under pressure, especially when their jobs are at stake." Denise's voice was gentle but insistent. "You said he was about to be promoted, right? And his colleagues were questioning his judgment. So what? That doesn't excuse what he said." "No, it doesn't. But it might explain it." Denise paused. "Grace, in 3 weeks of talking about this man, you never once mentioned him being cruel or dismissive. You said he listened, that he asked about Marcus, that he encouraged your dreams. Does that sound like someone who was just being kind out of pity?" Grace stared out at the cemetery, where snow was beginning to accumulate on the headstones. "It doesn't matter what I thought he was like. I heard what he really thinks." "You heard what he said when he was cornered by people who were threatening his career. That's not the same thing. Whose side are you on, Dee?" "Yours. Always yours. But I'm also on the side of you not giving up the first real friendship you've had since Marcus died because of one overheard conversation." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. "He reduced our entire friendship to a mistake, Denise. He laughed about it." "Did he? Or did he survive a humiliating situation the only way he knew how?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Grace wanted to dismiss it, to hold on to her anger and hurt because they felt safer than the vulnerability of hoping again. But something in Denise's voice made her pause. "Even if you're right," Grace said quietly, "it doesn't change anything. I can't trust him now. I can't sit in that break room pretending everything is fine when I know what he really thinks of me. What if he tries to apologize? What if he explains? Then I'll listen. But I won't make the same mistake twice." After the call ended, Grace finally made herself walk to Marcus's grave. The snow was falling harder now, and her footsteps were the only marks in the white blanket covering the path. She knelt beside the headstone, brushing snow from the engraved letters of Marcus's name. "I messed up, baby," she whispered. "I let someone in and I got hurt. I should have known better." But even as she said the words, Grace could hear Marcus's voice in her memory, the conversation they'd had during his last visit home. He'd been struggling with nightmares, with guilt over decisions made in combat, with the weight of loss and survival. "The hardest part isn't the fear," he told her. "It's not knowing who to trust anymore. Everyone seems fake, like they're pretending to care when really they just want something from you." "What did you tell him?" Grace asked aloud, addressing her memory of that conversation. She remembered her response. "You can't let the bad ones make you give up on the good ones, Marcus. Trust is scary because it matters. If it didn't matter, it wouldn't hurt when someone broke it." Grace sat in the snow beside Marcus's grave, feeling the cold seep through her jeans, and realized she was facing the same choice she'd encouraged her son to make. She could protect herself by shutting out the possibility of connection, or she could risk being hurt again in exchange for the chance that some people, maybe even Kevin, were worth trusting. The snow continued to fall, and Grace remained beside Marcus's headstone until the cemetery's closing announcement echoed across the grounds. As she walked back to her car, she made a decision. She would go to work on Monday. She would face Kevin Mitchell and whatever awkwardness their changed relationship would bring. She wouldn't seek him out or manufacture opportunities for conversation, but she wouldn't run away either. If he wanted to apologize, she would listen. If he wanted to explain, she would consider his words. But she would not make herself small or invisible to spare him discomfort. She had survived too much to disappear now just because one person had failed to see her worth. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in his Lincoln Park penthouse, Kevin Mitchell was having his own dark weekend of the soul. He'd barely slept since Friday night, replaying the party conversation over and over, each repetition making him feel smaller and more ashamed. He'd spent Saturday researching veteran employment programs, reading testimonials for military families, trying to understand the full scope of what Grace had survived. The statistics were devastating. Veteran unemployment, suicide rates, the struggles of military families adjusting to civilian life. Grace's story wasn't unique. It was part of a national tragedy he'd never bothered to notice. On Sunday, Kevin found himself driving aimlessly through Chicago, eventually parking outside Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery. He didn't go inside. He had no right to intrude on Grace's private ritual, but he sat in his BMW in the parking lot, watching other visitors come and go, trying to imagine the weight of losing a child to war's invisible wounds. His phone buzzed with texts from Brad and Tyler, casual messages about Monday's meetings and weekend plans. Kevin deleted them without responding. The easy camaraderie of Friday night now felt poisonous, like complicity in something he couldn't name but knew was wrong. He thought about his grandfather Patrick, about the Korean War medals in their display case, about the conversations they'd never had because Kevin was too young to ask the right questions. What would his grandfather think of Kevin's behavior? What would he say about a man who befriended a Gold Star mother and then betrayed that friendship to protect his corporate advancement? Kevin knew the answer, and it made him sick to his stomach. As Sunday evening approached, Kevin faced his own choice. He could pretend Friday night never happened, return to his normal routine, and hope Grace would simply fade back into invisibility. It would be easier, safer for his career, less complicated emotionally. Or he could find the courage to face what he'd done, to risk his pride and possibly his job by trying to make things right with a woman who had no reason to forgive him. Kevin thought about the stories Grace had shared, about Marcus's dreams, about her own hopes for teaching, about the strength it took to lace up her son's boots every morning and keep moving forward. She had trusted him with her deepest grief, and he had repaid that trust with cowardice. He picked up his phone and started typing a text message. "Grace, I need to explain about Friday night. Can we talk?" But before he could send it, he deleted the words. A text message wasn't enough. Some apologies required the courage of face-to-face honesty, the risk of looking someone in the eye while admitting your failures. Kevin would go to work early on Monday. He would find Grace before the building filled with people and their watching eyes. He would tell her the truth about Friday night, about the pressure he'd felt, about the cowardice that had made him betray their friendship. He couldn't guarantee she would forgive him. He couldn't promise that their relationship could be repaired. But he could offer honesty, accountability, and the kind of respect he should have shown from the beginning. Outside his penthouse windows, Chicago glittered with early winter beauty, the city lights reflecting off snow-covered streets like stars scattered across dark water. Tomorrow would bring consequences, difficult conversations, and choices that couldn't be undone. But for the first time since Friday night, Kevin Mitchell felt like he might be able to live with himself, if he could find the courage to face the woman whose trust he'd shattered and whose friendship had meant more to him than he'd realized until it was gone. Monday morning arrived with crisp November air and the kind of clear skies that made Chicago's skyline look like a postcard. Grace stood in her apartment at 4:47 a.m., staring at Marcus's combat boots by the front door. After 3 days of leaving them untouched, the sight of them felt both foreign and familiar, like meeting an old friend after a long absence. She had made her choice. Whatever happened with Kevin, whatever awkwardness awaited her at Meridian Financial Tower, she would not let one man's cowardice rob her of the connection she felt to her son. The boots were Marcus's gift to her, a symbol of his love and his belief in her strength. They belonged on her feet. Grace laced them up with deliberate care, feeling their familiar weight settle around her ankles like an embrace. Then she gathered her cleaning supplies and began the 12-block walk to work, her breath creating small clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Kevin had been at his desk since 4:30 a.m., unable to sleep, watching the clock crawl toward Grace's arrival time. He'd rehearsed different versions of his apology, but none of them felt adequate for the magnitude of what he'd done. How do you ask forgiveness for reducing someone's pain to entertainment, their trust to embarrassment, their worth to a charity case? At exactly 5:05 a.m., Kevin heard the familiar sound of Grace's cleaning cartwheels against the marble floor. His heart hammered against his ribs as he walked to his office doorway and saw her moving methodically through her morning routine, her desert tan boots clicking with military precision. "Grace," he called softly. She looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell." The formal address hit Kevin like a slap. After weeks of easy conversation and shared coffee, the return to professional distance felt like a door slamming shut. "Could we talk? Please?" Grace continued organizing her supplies, not meeting his eyes. "I have work to do. I know. I know you do. But I need to explain about Friday night." Grace's hands stilled on her cleaning supplies. "I don't think there's anything to explain. I understand the situation perfectly." "No," Kevin said, stepping closer but careful not to invade her space. "You don't. You couldn't. Because what happened up there, what I said, it wasn't the truth." Grace finally looked at him directly, and Kevin saw something in her eyes that was worse than anger. Disappointment so profound it looked like grief. "What part wasn't true?" she asked quietly. "The part where you said you were just being kind. The part where you called our friendship a mistake. Or the part where you laughed about it with your colleagues." Kevin felt heat rise in his cheeks. "All of it. Every word was a lie. Why should I believe you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Kevin realized that his words alone wouldn't be enough. Grace had heard his words before, on Friday night, when he thought she wasn't listening. She needed more than explanations. "Because I'm about to risk my career to prove it," Kevin said. Before Grace could respond, Kevin walked to the elevator and pressed the call button. When the doors opened, he gestured for her to follow. "Where are we going?" Grace asked. "To the penthouse. The partners have a breakfast meeting every Monday at 7. They're all there right now." Grace stared at him. "Kevin, what are you doing?" "Something I should have done Friday night." The elevator ride to the penthouse felt endless. Grace stood beside her cleaning cart, still uncertain what Kevin intended, but sensing that something significant was about to happen. Kevin's hands were shaking slightly, and she could see a muscle jumping in his jaw. The penthouse conference room was exactly as Grace had imagined. All glass and steel and leather chairs, with a view of Lake Michigan that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. 7 men in expensive suits sat around a mahogany table, discussing quarterly projections over catered breakfast. Kevin knocked on the glass door and entered without waiting for permission. The conversation stopped abruptly as the partners looked up in surprise. "Kevin," said Harold Morrison, the senior partner, checking his Rolex. "You're not scheduled for this meeting." "I know, sir." But I need to address something that came up at the holiday party. Kevin's voice was steady despite his trembling hands. Something that reflects poorly on the company's values and my own integrity. Grace remained by the door, suddenly understanding what Kevin was about to do and terrified by the implications. He was about to sacrifice his promotion, possibly his entire career, for a friendship she wasn't even sure existed anymore. "This is Grace Washington," Kevin continued, gesturing toward her. "She's been cleaning this building for 2 years, and she's one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. She's a 3-tour Afghanistan veteran, a Gold Star mother who lost her son to suicide after his service, and someone who deserves better than the disrespect she's received from this company's employees." The silence in the room was deafening. Grace could see the partners exchanging glances, could feel their discomfort at having their carefully segregated worlds collide. "Kevin," Harold said carefully, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No, sir." Friday night, several employees made inappropriate comments about Mrs. Washington's military service and her appearance. Instead of defending her, I participated in mocking someone who has sacrificed more for her country than any of us have sacrificed for anything. Brad Chen, who had been sitting frozen at the far end of the table, looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Tyler Rodriguez was staring at his coffee cup as if it held the secrets of the universe. Mrs. Washington's son, Lance Corporal Marcus Washington, earned a Purple Heart before taking his own life after struggling with PTSD, Kevin continued, his voice growing stronger. She wears his combat boots to honor his memory and her own service. Anyone who finds that amusing or inappropriate needs to examine their own character, not hers. Grace felt tears threatening behind her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time since Marcus's death, someone was publicly acknowledging his sacrifice, recognizing her loss, defending her dignity without asking for anything in return. Harold Morrison cleared his throat. "Kevin, while we appreciate your passion about this issue, I'm not sure this is the appropriate forum." "With respect, sir, I disagree. This company profits from contracts with defense contractors, from relationships with government agencies, from the freedom and security that people like Mrs. Washington helped protect. If we can't treat our veterans with basic dignity, we don't deserve those profits." Kevin turned to look at Grace, his eyes bright with something that looked like determination mixed with terror. "Mrs. Washington has an idea for a computer literacy program for transitioning veterans," he said, addressing the room but speaking to her. "It's exactly the kind of community investment this company claims to value. I'd like to propose that Meridian Financial fund and sponsor that program, with Mrs. Washington as its director." The silence that followed was so complete that Grace could hear her own heartbeat. The partners stared at Kevin as if he'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. Grace stared at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "That's quite a proposal," Harold said slowly. "Though I'm not sure Mrs. Washington has the qualifications to direct such a program. She has military communications training, first-hand knowledge of veteran transition challenges, and more integrity than most people in this building," Kevin replied. "If qualifications were really what mattered, we'd hire character instead of credentials." Grace found her voice. "Mr. Morrison, with respect, I appreciate Mr. Mitchell's faith in me, but I haven't agreed to any of this. I came here to clean your offices, not to be the subject of a corporate presentation." Harold's eyebrows rose. When Grace spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, the confidence of someone who had once coordinated communications in a war zone. "However," Grace continued, "if Meridian Financial is genuinely interested in supporting veteran transition programs, I'd be happy to discuss the parameters of such an initiative. I have extensive ideas about curriculum, funding models, and partnership opportunities with existing veteran service organizations. Kevin smiled for the first time since Friday night. This was the Grace he'd come to know: intelligent, capable, unintimidated by boardrooms or executive egos. "Well," Harold said, clearly struggling to process the morning's unexpected developments, "this is certainly unconventional. Kevin, I think we need to discuss your approach to employee relations and appropriate professional boundaries." "Yes, sir. I understand that my behavior may cost me the executive VP promotion. I'm prepared for that consequence." Grace looked at Kevin with new eyes. He was willing to sacrifice his career advancement for her dignity, for the principle that her service and sacrifice mattered. It was the kind of courage she'd seen in Marcus, the willingness to put values above personal gain. "Actually," said Margaret Chen, the only female partner and Harold's likely successor, "I think Kevin has identified an opportunity we should explore. Corporate social responsibility is increasingly important to our clients, and veteran support programs generate excellent publicity." She turned to Grace with genuine interest. "Mrs. Washington, would you be willing to submit a formal proposal for this computer literacy program? If it's viable, we might be able to structure it as a pilot project." Grace felt the room's energy shift. What had begun as Kevin's desperate attempt at redemption was transforming into a genuine business opportunity. "I'd be honored to submit a proposal," Grace said, "though I should mention that I'd want to continue my custodial duties during the program's development phase. I believe in finishing what I start." Harold Morrison laughed, the first genuine emotion he'd shown since they'd entered the room. "Mrs. Washington, I have a feeling you're going to fit in better around here than any of us expected." As they left the penthouse conference room, Grace and Kevin rode the elevator down in silence. The implications of what had just happened were still settling, the possibilities too large to process immediately. "Why did you do that?" Grace asked as the elevator reached the 37th floor. Kevin stepped out with her, leaning against the wall as if he needed support. "Because I realized that keeping my job wasn't worth losing my integrity. Because you trusted me with your story, and I betrayed that trust to protect my own comfort. Because Marcus deserved better, and so do you." Grace studied his face, seeing exhaustion and relief and something that might have been hope. "You might have just ruined your career," she said. "Maybe. Or maybe I just found out what my career is actually worth." Grace pushed her cleaning cart toward the break room, then stopped and looked back at Kevin. "Coffee?" she asked. "I think we have some things to talk about." Kevin's smile was tentative but genuine. "I'd like that. Very much." As they walked toward the break room together, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced since Marcus's death. The sense that her story was still being written, that chapters she'd thought were finished might actually be beginnings in disguise. Outside the windows of Meridian Financial Tower, Chicago hummed with Monday morning energy. But on the 37th floor, two unlikely friends were discovering that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the courage to tell the truth, even when, especially when, the truth costs everything you thought you wanted. Grace's boots clicked against the marble with their familiar rhythm, but today the sound felt different. Not like a countdown to nowhere, but like a march toward something new. Something that might honor Marcus's memory in ways she'd never imagined possible. The coffee was hot, the conversation was honest, and for the first time in 2 years, Grace Washington allowed herself to believe that the best parts of her story might still be ahead of her. 3 months later, Marine One would land on the building's rooftop, and Grace would walk toward it in those same combat boots, not as the invisible janitor who'd been mocked and dismissed, but as the director of the Meridian Veterans Transition Program, the woman whose son's sacrifice had inspired a corporate initiative that would help hundreds of veterans find dignity and purpose in civilian life. But that morning, over coffee in the executive break room, Grace and Kevin were just two people learning to trust again, discovering that some friendships are worth fighting for, and that the courage to do what's right often begins with a simple decision to see each other clearly. Marcus's boots had carried Grace through war, through grief, through the long journey from invisible to invaluable. Now they would carry her forward into a future where her service mattered, her story had power, and her son's legacy lived on in every veteran who found hope through the program she would build. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.